On WION Live Broadcast from New York, Ukraine awaits a hint as NATO leaders meet in Lithuanian capital of Vilnius for the annual summit. A battle for funding the federal government all set to escalate this week as lawmakers huddle for the US Congress session. And we look at the rise of India, a country on the cusp of dethroning the US on the list of biggest economies. All this and much more at these times only on WION World is One.
Hi everyone, welcome to WION Live Broadcast from New York City. I'm Susan Tehrani. First, let's take a look at the stories making headlines this hour. NATO vows to give Ukraine a clear and positive message on its request to join the alliance as Western leaders meet in Vilnius at a summit on Russia's doorstep. Moscow says that it's carefully monitoring the NATO summit in Vilnius, criticizing the anti-Russian character of the meeting where alliance members will discuss Ukraine's membership ambitions. Russian forces launched massive drone attacks targeting Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, as well as Odessa. Is the world job market on a brink of an AI revolution? OECD says the world's wealthiest nations must urgently prepare for the impact of an imminent AI revolution that will change jobs, create new ones, and make others disappear. Rescue teams raced to the state of Vermont after heavy downpours across the northeast of the United States wash out roads and force evacuations. Years ago, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in return for security assurances, which were given by Moscow, Washington, and London when it relinquished its nuclear arsenal to Russia in 1994. Now, the war-torn country wants ironclad protection from its allies as NATO leaders meet in the Lithuanian capital of Vilnius. More than 500 days since the war broke out in Ukraine, Kyiv has pressed to become a part of the military alliance. It sees it as a boost to deter the Russian aggression. But Ukraine's largest Western allies are still finalizing a joint framework that will pave the way for long-term security assurances for Kyiv. The United States and Germany are wary of any move that might take the alliance closer to war with Russia. The big hurdle for Ukraine to become a part of the alliance is the ongoing war. Ukraine knows it will not get entry into the alliance while the war with Russia continues because under Article 5, an attack on one member is an attack on all and would push the alliance into war with Russia. In the meantime, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says that the Vilnius summit must confirm Ukraine a de facto member of NATO, as the majority of NATO members have stood together with his country. Zelensky expects that weapons supply for Ukraine in its war against Russia would also be discussed at the summit. Although Secretary General of NATO Jens Stoltenberg has said that Kyiv will not become a member while the war rages, and the summit will not issue a formal invitation like they did for Finland and Sweden, who were invited to join the alliance, directly bypassing the membership action plan. While Finland became a NATO member recently, Sweden is also said to be given membership after Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan met with the Swedish Prime Minister and NATO Secretary General for talks on Sweden's membership, following which Stoltenberg announced that Turkey had agreed to move ahead with Sweden's NATO bid. Take a listen.
I have just had a constructive meeting with President Erdogan and Prime Minister Kristersson. I am glad to announce that as a result, President Erdogan has agreed to forward the accession protocol for Sweden to the Grand National Assembly as soon as possible, and work closely with the Assembly to ensure ratification.
Although for Ukraine to become a part of the alliance might seem like a long road ahead, the Biden administration is reportedly considering proposing an Israeli model for Ukraine in NATO. It is a security model that Western leaders, including the U.S. president, have compared with what Israel has now, a deal that would be a limited commitment and not include a collective defense guarantee. According to reports, the White House would pledge to continue providing more military aid to Ukraine regardless of the outcome of its ongoing counteroffensive. The deal would likely be for a shorter period than the commitment to Israel, which typically runs in 10-year intervals. Moreover, on the sidelines of the summit, an announcement is expected to come from Ukraine's key allies. According to reports, the declaration from most of the G7 leaders will be on an agreement to launch negotiations with Kyiv on a collection of bilateral security commitments. These will be aimed at bolstering Ukraine's ability to defend itself and deter future Russia aggression. Okay, for more on this, we are being joined by Greg Swenson from Chicago. He is the founder of Brig McAdam and an expert on international affairs. Greg, thank you so much for joining us on WION. So it seems that Ukraine is adamant to at least have some sort of pathway into NATO. However, that's very unlikely considering what we know about Article 5 and also the ongoing war. Do you think that there is room right now for some kind of negotiation where some sort of ceasefire or an end to the war can be discussed between NATO and Ukraine, and then ultimately Ukraine and Russia?
Sure. I don't think there's ever a bad time for negotiating and trying to put an end to, either put an end to the war or at least have a ceasefire and further negotiations. So I don't think there's ever a bad time for that, as long as it's done through the proper channels. I didn't really agree with the back channel conversations that went about in New York last week. But I think it's important to mention that, this right now, NATO membership for Ukraine is not just unlikely or impossible because they don't have the votes for it, frankly, but also it's a bit of a distraction, so, it puts some pressure or undermines NATO cohesion. It also stimulates or supports one of the Russian arguments, the original Russian arguments for the war. Not that you have to agree with that, but it's one that I would think NATO membership or the discussion of NATO membership for Ukraine will actually help Russia sustain that argument. And then thirdly, it's really a distraction from much higher priority issues. One of which you mentioned, which is trying to put an end to this war, immediately. And then secondly, you have some real weak spots in NATO right now that are not being addressed, or at least not being addressed successfully, which is the fact that all but 7 of the 32 NATO countries are not spending 2% of their GDP on defense spending. So there are real bigger issues. And again, I think the Ukraine discussion, as far as membership goes, is just a distraction.
Absolutely. And you mentioned 7 by next year. Even NATO itself admits, although it sees it as a victory, only 11 of the 30, right, well, now maybe 32, will be able to meet those targets. So one has to wonder, what is the end goal here, at least in terms of the United States moving forward with its foreign policy regarding Russia and Ukraine? On the one hand, it doesn't want to be a party to the war. As you mentioned, these back channel negotiations were in an accident that happened here in New York because it didn't want to directly be involved in these negotiations. And then there's reports of cluster munitions now being sent to Ukraine. So can you talk about where does the U.S. stand? Is there a plan?
Well, that's the problem. So far, the U.S. support of Ukraine has been very incremental in nature. The President Biden and the administration has really, in many ways, they're constantly dragging their feet and really playing defense instead of getting ahead of this. Some of the munitions and long-range missiles that are finally being delivered, as well as F-16s, should have been done 500 days ago when this war began. So I think the incrementalism has been a real problem for the Biden administration and for their support of Ukraine. And secondly, the talk about bad timing. Yes, there will be 11 members of NATO spending at least 2% of GDP in the next year, or by 2025, which you pointed out. The problem is that the United States, which is clearly the most important member of NATO from a defense perspective, is cutting defense spending. There's a 3% cut in Biden's defense budget. That's really bad timing and dangerous for not only for the U.S., but dangerous for the world.
What an excellent point. Absolutely. Greg Swenson, thank you so much for joining us on WION, and we look forward to having you again very soon.
Thanks a lot. Great to be here.
Continuing with the spotlight on Ukraine, while the West hasn't given Kyiv a concrete answer on its NATO bid yet, it has not backed out from providing military aid to the war-torn country. Our next story is about France's big announcement about sending Scalp long-range missiles to Ukraine. And a big boost for Ukraine, according to sources, these air-launched long-range missiles have already arrived in the country. However, there is a cluster attached. A French president, Emmanuel Macron, has clarified in advance that the missiles would aid Ukraine to defend its territory from Russian invasion and boost its counteroffensive. These have already been supplied by London under the name Storm Shadow.
Considering the situation and the counter-offensive led by Ukraine, I decided to increase the deliveries of weapons and equipment and to provide a long-range missile capacity to Ukrainians, all while maintaining the clarity and the coherence of our doctrine, meaning to allow Ukrainians to defend their territory.
But how would these weapons help Kyiv? It is a 1,300 kilogram missile armed with conventional explosives. It has a long range of over 250 kilometers. This makes it the longest range Western weapon supplied to Kyiv so far, known for its precision. The missile uses internal navigation, GPS, and terrain referencing to chart a low-altitude COU. These missiles are designed to meet the requirements of pre-planned attacks against high-value fixed or stationary targets. They are able to operate in extreme conditions. Not only that, they offer operators a highly flexible deep strike capability based around a sophisticated mission planning system. This advanced weapon system has been previously used in conflicts in Iraq, Libya, and Syria. Torrential downpour has unleashed flash floods on northeastern parts of the United States. President Joe Biden has declared a state of emergency in Vermont. While attending the NATO summit in Lithuania, President Biden's declaration has authorized the Federal Emergency Management Agency, known as FEMA, to coordinate all disaster relief efforts across Vermont, where heavy rainfall has triggered life-threatening flash floods. Swift water rescue teams have already performed over 50 rescue operations. Over 13 million Americans have been told to stay vigilant. Meanwhile, Vermont's capital has issued an emergency health order as the Winsuki River, which runs through the city, has risen to its second highest level on record, behind only the historic flood of 1927. A battle over how to fund the federal government is poised to escalate this week when Congress returns from a 2-week break. The Republican-controlled U.S. House of Representatives and the Democratic-led Senate will start to seek the upper hand in a spending showdown that could trigger a government shutdown just months after Congress narrowly avoided a default. The House Republican majority is on a collision course with the Senate, as the appropriators in both the chambers advance conflicting versions of a sweeping package, which must become law by September 30th in order to prevent, a government shutdown. Republicans are pushing their leaders, House Speaker Kevin McCarthy and others, to cut budgets below the levels he and U.S. President agreed to a little more than a month ago. But the Senate appropriators are aiming for a slew of bipartisan deals, all of which point to difficult negotiations ahead as the Congress returns from a 2-week July 4th break. House Republicans are aiming to craft a series of 12 detailed spending bills covering every aspect of government funding. Last year, all 12 were crammed into one sweeping omnibus bill. The Senate negotiators, who were largely sidelined during the recent talks between House Republicans and the White House over the federal government's $31.4 trillion debt ceiling, we're working on bills that are attracting strong bipartisan support. Moreover, a host of hot-button issues ranging from abortion to transgender rights are expected to be pulled into the debate, further complicating matters. If the lawmakers fail to agree on a budget before the next fiscal year begins on October 1st, the United States could see its 4th partial government shutdown in a decade.
Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher.
Our next story is about how the global economic order could be reshapen. Today, we present you with the rise of the mighty India, a country on the cusp of dethroning the United States, which is predicted to drop to the 3rd spot on the list of the biggest economies by the year 2075. Hold on tight as we unveil the extraordinary factors propelling India's rise.
A land of over 1.4 billion dreamers is about to rewrite the economic rulebook. With the fastest growing economy among major global players, India is on the cusp of witnessing an economic revolution led by a population that is hungry for success and fueled by innovative technologies. According to Goldman Sachs research, India's path to economic greatness is illuminated by 2 key drivers: demographics and technology. India's booming population, coupled with its remarkable progress in innovation, positions the country to challenge the world's economic status quo. But that's not all. India's story unfolds with a plot twist that centers around capital investment. Goldman Sachs research highlights India's increasing capital investment as a game changer. With falling dependency ratios, rising incomes, and a thriving financial sector, India's savings rate is set to soar, and that means more capital available to drive massive investments. But such ambitious targets have challenges of similar scale. Among the biggest is India's labour force participation rate. The labour force participation rate in India has seen a decline over the past 15 years, with women's participation rate being significantly lower than men's. A mere 20% of all working-age women in India are currently employed. Despite the challenges, S&P Global and Morgan Stanley predict India is on track to become the world's third largest economy by 2030. India, with its unstoppable might, is set to overtake Germany and Japan, catapulting itself to the ranks of the US and China as economic powerhouses. While Germany grapples with a relentless recession and Japan struggles to escape a technical storm, India stands tall, shattering all expectations. The Indian economy has grown at a 6.1% growth rate in the first quarter of 2023 and is expected to grow at a staggering 7.2% for the rest of the year, while the US and China face formidable challenges. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
Just 2 days before the release of the film Mission Impossible, Tom Cruise signed autographs and poses for photographs with fans at the New York premiere of Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning Part 1.
I've just worked to become very competent at it, and I train in ways that are in a manner that is very extreme, and I build up to it. I don't just jump on and do it. I'm constantly building up to it. And on the day when I am doing it, it's very, I'm just focusing on performance, and I'm going through all the things that I've trained in.
The future of professional golf will be debated in the American Senate later today. The PGA Tour accepts it is partially to blame for the general confusion concerning the merger with Live Golf. Live Golf CEO Greg Norman and the governor of Saudi Arabia's public investment fund, known as PIF, Yasser Al Rumayyan, have both declined to appear before congressional hearings. Both have quoted scheduling conflicts, and neither are American citizens regardless. PGA Tour Commissioner Jay Moynihan is also not expected to testify, as he is currently on a medical break. Democratic senators from Connecticut, Richard Blumenthal, has invited the Tour, Live Golf, and the PIF to testify within days of the merger announcement last month. Excerpts from Blumenthal's planned opening statement have appeared on Golf Digest and are pretty scathing. Blumenthal says, "We hope that today's hearing will help us uncover not only the reasons for the PGA Tour's sudden reversal and what it means for golf, but to understand what similar investments by authoritarian governments with deep pockets could mean for our country, for our national security, and for the world." The PGA Tour COO and acting commissioner Ron Price has also posted an op-ed in The Athletic arguing that the tour will remain in charge. Quote, "We are stewards of the organization's long-term health and leadership, weighed against the prospect of a continued unsustainable battle that threatened our very existence, given the safeguards that guarantee our self-determination and the possibilities afforded by new investment." Yes was the clear answer to the framework agreement. End of quote. It's time to say goodbye from New York City. I'm Susan Tehrani, but don't go away. A lot more news and headlines coming up only on WION World is One.